This question from Nick on X. We heard the sad news this week that Italian club Brescia have gone bust after 114 years. How was this allowed to happen, and where does the blame lie?
I mean, there are very specific situations. Like, there's very specific issues, and like any club that goes bust, there was financial irregularities. They missed payments. They've had a points deduction, and ultimately, kind of spirals out of control. But I can't help put this in a much wider context. That I think this is almost a bit of a canary in the coal mine in this sense. That is related to what we've been talking about in the main pod this week about the Club World Cup. When you speak to people in European leagues, that's the actual body that represents the collective European leagues. They've been saying for months now that the top end of football is causing their... And this is the bread and butter. This is the lifeblood of football in this sense. The top end of the game is causing them huge problems. It's causing a massive upward drag. There's obviously this... which affects on wages. There's huge focus at the top end, the kind of the detriment of everything else. And people in the European leagues openly say that over the next 5 years, as we move towards, potentially 48 team Club World Cups every 2 years, what the Champions League is, they think scores of clubs, I mean, the figure that was said to me was something like 500. 500 clubs could go bankrupt in the next 5 years. Because they just can't keep up with that level, and because there's going to be such a kind of a split between the kind of the earthy, ground of the game and this kind of higher level. And while Brescia have their specific issues, as every single club that goes bankrupt will, it is in the context of this and what is sustainable football in 2025.
Yeah, I think you can't separate. I mean, bear in mind the last time they were in the top flight was quite recently, 1920. Mario Balotelli at that point, of course. But look, I think you can't really separate what has happened with them to what has been happening to Sampdoria. Sampdoria, another huge historic club who were going down until this happened to Brescia. So now they've been sort of semi-reprieved, and they're going to have the relegation play out against Salernitana over the next couple of legs. And bear in mind, in recent months, you've had some of like the legends of Sampdoria, like Ivani, Mancini, Lombardo, coming in and saying, we're going to save this club and all the rest of it. And then they've kind of got there and realised, oh, actually, the issues are really endemic, and we're leaking money left and right. It's been poorly managed for a very long time. And it's been really hard. Now, they have got this reprieve, but we could see Brescia really just going off the map and Sampdoria end up playing in the third tier. And bear in mind, Salernitana, very, very recently in the top flight as well. So one of those is going to have completed an absolutely massive fall. Now, the shorter answer to Nick's question is 2 words: Massimo Cellino. Because, of course, he was in charge of, he's the owner of Leeds United for a long time. He's been the owner of Brescia now for, 6-7 years. And really, this all comes down to him deciding he doesn't want to fund anymore. Now, they had an 8 million, mainly tax debt, and they were offered a sort of plea bargain of 3 million. And he said, no, I'm not going to pay it. And that's that. Now, of course, I think part of that might be the fact that prosecutors and investigators have been into Brescia, have been into the football club, have been after Cellino, and that have finance there and had a look at them, and they're going over them with a fine-tooth comb. They think there's sort of VAT-based fraud. That's what their case that they're building is about. So even if Brescia go, the case will continue, but it's just another really sad example in modern football of like an institution of a club.
It's shocking.
And it is an institution of a club. And we talked about Balotelli, of course, Roberto Baggio, Roberto De Zerbi is from Brescia. He talked about how broken he was about it quite recently, and never mind the fact that Guardiola, Lucescu, etc. went through there as well. The fact is that the fans and the generations of fans who've supported that club are being made to carry the can for just these completely unscrupulous people who are the current custodians of the club.
We've had some great questions on this Ask OTC. We always welcome your questions as well. A gosh, I'm still reeling from some of what you said in the last answer, not least about the Sampdoria connection as well. Anyway, this question from Stu on Instagram: is Cristian Chivu a good replacement for Simone Inzaghi at Inter? You might want to tell us who Cristian Chivu is.
Inter legend, Cristian Chivu.
Romanian legend.
A Romanian legend as well. So a player for Inter, a wearer of rugby-esque headgear, like Petr Cech, and also someone, and I think this is very relevant, who did academy teams at Inter for quite a while. Working with youth players is, I think, or working with younger players on a development tip is about to become a lot more important at Inter, because I think you can look at it from the outside and say, okay, since he left the Inter academy so he could go and take on a big job. So like 2/3 of the way through last season, he gets the Parma job. Does very well to keep them up, makes them difficult to beat, get a couple of big wins. They roll over Juventus, they win at Atalanta, and he steers them away from what would have been a pretty damaging relegation. So he did a good job there. Now, a bit like Vincent Kompany last summer, he's in no position to get this job when we start at the beginning of the managerial search or the coaching search. He's probably, I don't know, 5th or 6th choice, maybe not quite as far down the list as Kompany was. But I think what Kompany has shown is that you don't have to be first choice to be the right guy for the job. It's worked out really, really well for Kompany, and I think it will continue certainly for the next little while to work out well for Kompany at Bayern. Now, of course, he had more experience going into the job of a senior team than Chivu did, and it's a very, very small sample size we have of Chivu. But I think knowing the club and knowing how to develop players successfully is really, really important, because Beppe Marotta, going back 6 months, maybe more now, has said, and I think you look at this Inter team and think, how relevant is Chivu's limited experience with quite an old team? They're going to get younger. They're about to get younger. And I think that will change a lot over the next little while, because Marotta has said, well, we need to start getting in some players with resale value. Funnily enough, he framed it like that rather than, which is a very ex-Juventus sporting director way of framing it, rather than saying, because we need to make our team more dynamic and faster and all that other sort of stuff. Of course, he was speaking before they got absolutely flamed in the Champions League final at this point. And the physical side of that and the age profile side of that was very much part of how the game went, I felt. Now, I think especially going forward, when you look at the fact that Inter will not just look to reinforce their status of the best team in Italy, and of course, they weren't the champions last season, but let's be honest, the best team in Italy, but retain that position of being a constant Champions League challenger and getting into the back of the Champions League. I think, Miguel, you can see the way that football's going now. Not just PSG in the final, Barcelona, the other really fascinating, thrilling and successful team who could have easily ended up in the final, team in the Champions League. You've got to be looking at it not just from a resale perspective, and clearly that's something that's always important in modern Italian football. But if you're Inter, you've got to be saying, not only do we financially have to wash our own face, we need to get closer to the way that modern European football's going. Which
is now a young player's game. I mean, in that context, obviously, a player and team that Inter knocked out, Yamal, there's been a lot of kind of discussion about how he's played so much more games at his age than Messi. That's actually now an inevitability, because so much of football is based on intense pressing. No matter what philosophy you play, no matter what, pressing has become a core, and that you need squads that kind of are engineered towards that. And Inter, I mean, it's not really, given its age profile. It can still do it, but obviously the question is now how sustainable that is. And we saw how exhausted they were by the time the final came round.
Yeah,
and now it's about a wider shift.
Isn't Stu's question about Cristian Chivu, though, predicated on the 5-0 defeat in the Champions League against PSG? And now that will be part of the, I suppose, burden that Chivu has to deal with to rebuild.
I think that's the way we're reading it I guess Stu's question has got quite a philosophical question at the heart of it, actually, because not only is it asking, is Chivu experienced enough to take on a team that expects to compete at the top level in all the trophies it enters? And the short answer to that has to be no or don't know. But we've interpreted it as the direction that they need to take. And you, like us, have interpreted it as the sense of there needs to be some sort of mini rebuild. Now, the rebuild, I don't think has to go all into what happened in the Champions League final. They needed a rebuild anyway, and Marotta, as I said, has been acutely aware of that for some time. As we've said on previous weeks' OTCs, I think this Inter team, it's been obvious for months, maybe the best part of a year, that they were coming to the end of a cycle. And this would be the end of a cycle. And whatever happened in the final, this would be the last chance of this particular team to do it. Now, we've seen a couple of the fringes move on already. Of course, Arnautovic has gone. Tuku Correa has gone as well. And I would expect to see some quite aggressive trading in the back half of the window. And I guess that will show us exactly how much they want Chivu to shape the team and how much they see him as a long term, rather than simply what was available at this particular moment. Because, of course, the Champions League final, as we said before, recently on the pod, sort of played against Inter because their season went on for a week longer than everyone else's. There's this massive coaching musical chairs, and they don't get first pick.
Miguel?
Yeah, and it's funny that as well, actually, because about a month ago, I remember hearing that the big three were all actually looking at De Zerbi, which might be interesting. Italian football, despite kind of what's happened at Marseille, and maybe he's got a certain combustible perception, a lot of it, in terms of purely tactics, he's so highly rated in Italy, but none of them have yet moved. I wonder, is that just related to basically that personality?
Yeah, I mean, I think with De Zerbi, it's for a good time rather than a long time.
Yeah.
Certainly that's what his resume suggests at the moment. But I think if you're Inter and you were interested in De Zerbi, you would be interested in him being the coach after the coach after. So I don't think him succeeding Inzaghi directly with the squad that he'd been inheriting, I don't see how he'd turn it around. I don't see how he'd have the time or patience to turn it around.
Yeah, if you think that question was a good question, this is a great question, I think, on many different levels. From Harry on YouTube, does Jack Grealish have the right qualities to replace Florian Wirtz at Erik ten Hag's Bayer Leverkusen?
The Jack Grealish of 5 years ago, it would be an interesting replacement. But I suppose the big issue with this now is that it's not just about replacing Wirtz. It's about kind of Grealish rehabilitating his career or rehabilitating his style of play, I think. Because, I mean, one of the great discussions over the last few years in English football, and I think this is all the more interesting in a European context, really, given that this has come from the football that has kind of shaped the game more than any other, which is Pep Guardiola's positional play. And in that, there hasn't been a space for what Grealish is, really. Hence, Guardiola turned him from one of the most individualistic dribblers, who you would actually think would quite enjoy Luis Enrique's interpretation of the game, into someone who basically just retains the ball, retains possession, retains control, doesn't really get to beat people, doesn't really get to kind of like do what he did at Villa, and kind of just suddenly surge through and score.
It's funny, isn't it, how like Guardiola and Mourinho are very ideologically different, but basically
horseshoe theory in football, isn't it?
He's been a modern Joe Cole, you could argue.
Yeah.
That's how I would compare it.
And I think what's interesting here, like let's divorce ourselves from the financial realities of it for the moment, because the financial realities of it mean that any deal to send Grealish to Leverkusen is incredibly unlikely to happen. I just don't see how they can make the numbers work.
I mean, there is, with the Wirtz thing, there is talk of that, because I've heard this from a few places now, and given some of the players that I've been surprised that Leverkusen have been dropped into the conversation. One of them was actually Sancho, but obviously that's not going to happen with Ten Hag there. They are willing to spend big on one player, maybe, just from the Wirtz sale.
I mean, that's it. It's not really the fee; it's the wages, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, when like Liverpool and Leverkusen have been looking at various formulas for the Florian Wirtz transfer. Obviously, they're close at the time of recording. Maybe they've even come to an agreement by the time you're listening to this. I don't know. But they're not that far away. As soon as Liverpool floated the idea of some sort of part exchange, they were just no. Because the amount of wages they would be inheriting as not just a one-off number, but as a recurrent expense, which would completely knock out of kilter what they have at the moment. Bear in mind, they have a much smaller wage bill than Borussia Dortmund, for example, as we've spoken about before. Inheriting a big Premier League wage, whether that's Harvey Elliott, who was mentioned in the conversations with Florian Wirtz, or Jack Grealish, who's on that next level above, I think is very hard to imagine.
The one thing on that is maybe the willingness for someone like Grealish, who, to be fair, is like, I mean, despite certain perceptions of him, he's actually quite a decent, open-minded lad.
Find happiness by taking a wage cut?
Well, I wouldn't be completely surprised if he's just open to the experience.
Yeah.
And I mean, this is something that's happened now. I mean, like, the game is, especially if you're in your prime years, which I suppose what now, from your late teens to early 20s, or sorry, late teens to late 20s, even into early 30s, the game is a wash up money. And I mean, even if you look at it in those terms, the way to get more money is basically to make yourself a prime player who people want.
Yeah, and we are talking in a world where Gabri Vega has just taken a 90% wage cut to leave Saudi Arabia and come to Europe and
I wonder what Tony Cruz thinks of that.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe a belated apology. I don't know. But look, I think in terms of how it would work out playing wise, I think it would be quite interesting, Grealish at Leverkusen. Not just because he has most of the technical ability, I think, to fill the Wirtz role. And it is a role that has, certainly under Xabi Alonso, had a lot of responsibility because he got that extra level of freedom, as we've talked about before. Xabi Alonso told me that himself. He said, flow is a special case, I think is the way he put it. And I think Grealish, considering the short leash he's been on at Manchester City, would really appreciate that. I think it would be a really fun thing to see. I think the other thing is, after being under Guardiola and putting himself at the behest of the team for all this time, he's not going to be a passenger off the ball either. So I think that could really, really work for them. So let's continue that daydream, Harry, and not really embrace the financial side of it. Unless, as Miguel says, he's going to do a Gabri Vega.
And by the way, I'm not Harry, but thank you. Another cracking question, though, from Norbert, not for footballing reasons. Norbert sent us this email that asks, with Robert Lewandowski announcing that he will not play for Poland under Miguel Delaney, what does this mean for their World Cup hopes? Well, Norbert, I can tell you, as of now, as of this recording, Miguel Delaney has gone. And where does that leave Poland then, Andy?
It was only ever going to go one way. If Lewandowski turns around and says, I'm not playing for you, what are you left with? You're completely stuck, really. This isn't Neymar saying, well, I'm not happy with Jorge Jesus possibly getting the Brazil job. This is something completely different. This is your captain, arguably the country's best player of all time, who still, by the way, at 36, has loads in the tank and has just had his best season in absolutely years. Difficult to imagine Poland without him. So, I think not surprised that it's come to a head, even though it has happened quite quickly.
Should we put this down, Miguel, to simply player power over a coach?
It's more than that, though, because I mean, when we talk about player power, we're talking about basically just kind of the weight of a dressing room and how a coach is always dispensable, where you can't just kind of change an entire squad. This is about like someone's historic legacy with no player has this much power. No one player, and even
he does though.
But that's what I mean. No other player has this much power, and even as you can tell from the accent, when Andy said, the immediate thought that came to mind was Roy Keane in 2002. With the Irish, despite what Keane was, Ireland stuck with McCarthy.
Yeah, and I guess this is different because Lewandowski is so huge, so globally huge, and of course, I think the age is a big part of it. So not only is he saying, well, actually, you've really hurt me from taking the captaincy off me. And probably it gives a different account of their conversation. So maybe we'll never truly get to the bottom of it. But to say, well, actually, you've hurt me so much that I can't play for the national team while you're in charge. And is the country going to do me out of one last World Cup? Yeah. I mean, there's only one answer to that, again, isn't there?
And there's another slight difference with the Irish comparison that you made with Roy Keane. I think with Robert Lewandowski, it's not just about him, it's about all the other players who are thinking we can't play without him. Whereas the Irish players weren't all supportive of Roy Keane, were they?
Well,
there's a split, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, look, with anyone that big, there will be people who murmur about them in the dressing room. But I think you're right in that Poland simply cannot do it without Lewandowski. You know, he is by far their best player. Before we even talk about his career-long status and all the rest of it. And I just wonder, when we've been talking in the main OTC yesterday about mental and physical freshness, you look at how physically powerful Lewandowski came into this season looking at the age of 36, which is remarkable. Of course, we know all the stuff like he keeps himself unbelievably fit, his wife's a dietitian, all that sort of stuff. We talked about the Club World Cup as well in the main thing, which Barcelona aren't involved in. That is a huge, huge boost for him as well. And so when you look at what sort of condition players will be going into the next domestic season, and by extension, what sort of condition they'll be in by the time we get to next summer going into the World Cup, well, Lewandowski has sidestepped at least a little bit of that.
Let's just pause with the passion for a moment and think of a Game of the Week recommendation, as we always ask you to do on Ask OTC. But through the prism of this question by Jude on Blue Sky, which Club World Cup matchup are you most looking forward to this summer, Miguel?
So the two that I would have picked are actually just fall outside this week. One is next Friday, one next Saturday, which is Boca Bayern, and then Chelsea Flamengo, which I think could be the most competitive game in the entire group stage. So, but before then, the one I'm going for then, and I suppose I hinted at this with the Boca reference, is Boca Benfica. Just because, I mean, you know, we spoke on yesterday's show about how if you're looking for potential surprise and kind of the impact of South American football, you're probably looking to the Brazilians. But on the other side of that, let's be fair, there's probably no non-European club in football that has the mystique that Boca does. Hence, you get all these European players want to play there. Thomas Muller is talking about how he's looking forward to the highlight of playing them. And it's going to, and given that, and given the kind of this modern mystique that Boca have developed, I think it's going to be interesting to see them pit them against a big European club, albeit a European club that is actually, I think, quite beatable for them. We're not talking about one of the super clubs, despite Benfica's great history. We're talking about a big club from one of the kind of non-Big Five leagues who've had a difficult season. And I think there's a game here. And
with massive South American influence as well.
Yeah.
Over the last 20 years, Benfica. Of course, we have to say, when you're talking about the connection between Boca Juniors and football elsewhere, remember AFC Wimbledon strip in 23-24? The sort of Boca design.
I don't
you've got to see, if you haven't got one, you need to have one, really. I mean, the guy who designed the kit told me that he'd actually based it on 90s Panama rather than Boca Juniors, but it hasn't stopped lots of Boca Juniors fans coming down to see AFC Wimbledon in the last couple of seasons.
Thanks for that connection. Back to
You're
the
welcome.
actual question, though. Okay, so you're going for Benfica, Boca as your game of the week.
Yeah.
And what would you eat with it? Are you going Portuguese or
Argentinian?
Argentinian.
My one experience at the Bombonera, I had one of the best sandwiches of my life outside, a choripan. So if I can manage something similar.
What's in a choripan?
It's better. So it was the kind of chorizo, but Argentine chorizo, not the Spanish that I would associate with, in simple bread and ketchup, and it was incredible.
You're not going for corned beef with that, are you?
No.
Okay, I'm just checking. And thank you. What about you, Andy? What would you go for?
I've kept it old Europe, I'm afraid. We're going back to day one of the Club World Cup. Paris Saint-Germain, in their first game since the Champions League final, of course, playing Atletico Madrid. with PSG, where Atletico and Simeone would have liked to be in recent seasons, or all the way going back to 2014, if you want to look at it that way. I'll be at this game, LA, Sunday, midday kickoff, so 8 p.m. UK time. And it'll be in the Rose Bowl in Pasadena, which is a big open bowl, of course, where they had the 1994 World Cup.
Indeed.
Midday will be, I guess, an early test of exactly what playing in incredible heat with no shade will be like, I suppose. So I guess laying down the conditions, not just for this Club World Cup, but maybe for the World Cup next summer as well. Look, it's a huge moment for PSG. I don't know if they've got enough left in the tank to really top off this season, or if it really matters now they've got what they really wanted. But again, we were talking about in the main show, the clubs that really need to project internationally. Atletico are definitely one of those as well. So they will be looking to curry favour against the considerable Hispanic community in Los Angeles.
You did say curry, because there's one Indian restaurant in Los Angeles, or there was only one when I lived there 30 years ago. I'm sure you're not game for that. May I recommend Pink's hot dogs then to go with it?
You may, but you would be politely rejected, because for a midday kickoff, you can't have something that's going to sit on your stomach. Just go for a couple of tacos.
Yeah. It's something fresh and that sort of potential heat as well.
Yeah, it's what LA's all about. It's what Atletico are all about.
Not fresh, something kind of like cooler. I'd go for a ceviche or something.
Yeah. I reckon that sounds good. Maybe just stop at 2 tacos rather than the normal 6, Dotun?
And in case you're wondering if this is a culinary podcast, may I just say, look, we always ask our experts to recommend a game of the week, and crucially, as importantly, they also suggest the food that we should be having with it. And that's what all of that was about. So let me just remind you of the game of the week selections. Andy's gone for PSG versus Atletico Madrid. Miguel's pick, Boca Juniors. I'm salivating at both of these, at both of them, but Boca Juniors not least. Boca Juniors versus Benfica, and it's on Wednesday at 11 p.m.